Hello and welcome back to the Debrief. If the main episode was the street-level horror, bodies moving past choice, a city watching, and leadership trying to solve panic with policy, this is the part of the show where we slow down and look at the gears. Because the dancing plague of 1518 is one of those stories that gets flattened into a punchline. Ha ha ha, medieval people dance themselves to death. It's like a TikTok challenge that got out of hand. But if you strip off the meme version, if you rip the fig leaf off the distance, you're left with something uglier and way more human. The population in the Alsace region of France in the early 1500s were cosmically stressed. Not my plans got canceled stressed, but more of we just had the bubonic plague, we just had many famines, God might be angry stressed. And into that pressure cooker, one body starts moving in the street, then another, then another. It's not joy, it's not celebration, but it is compulsion. And the part that keeps me up at night isn't even the dancing, it's the moment the town has to decide what the dancing means. Because meaning is never neutral. Once you decide it's a curse, you treat it like a curse. Once you decide it's overheated blood, you treat it like a pressure valve. Once you decide it's a public problem, you manage it like a public problem. And sometimes the management becomes the accelerant. So in the debrief, we're going to be doing 4 things. We're going to keep it tight and keep it honest. We're going to go over what we can and what we cannot prove, because this story is a magnet for exaggerated numbers. We're going to go over some extra content, mainly the famine and disease cycles, the St. Vitus belief framework, and why ergotism is such a tempting bad-bred villain. The third is we're going to draw some modern parallels, look at how stress spreads, how crowds reinforce symptoms, and how institutions can misfire when they pick the wrong explanation. And lastly, our listener question of the week that isn't really medieval at all, but when did your body tell the truth before your brain was ready to admit it? Now, if you're asking, Dylan, are all of these stories that you cover ever not going to be a bummer? Well, no. They're all pretty sad. I'm going to be honest with you. History is a sad thing. Now, there are happy historical events, like the day peanut butter was invented, or the first time you saw Lion King and your brain chemistry changed forever. But this one, and the last one, and maybe the future one, are a bummer, because it's an episode where the body becomes a broadcast tower, where suffering takes the shape the community understands, and then the community tries to treat the shape with policy. So, let's go ahead and get on to it, shall we? Okay, so our Naked Regrets segment, and this is what we can say with confidence. In 1518, Strasbourg experienced a very real outbreak in which people danced uncontrollably. Apparently unwillingly, over a period that sources commonly describe as lasting weeks and winding down after roughly 2 months. Now, what we can't prove, like it's a modern incident report, is the one universally agreed number of dancers, the one universally agreed death toll, or one universal accepted cause. Because even mainstream summaries emphasize uncertainty around the why, and the details just get messier the more specific that you get. So the right stance here is real event with fuzzy edges and multiple plausible forces. If anyone tries to sell you a neat single explanation, they're not doing history, they're doing a tidy story. And speaking of stories, the internet loves mass hysteria as if it were a mic drop. But this wasn't mass hysteria in a vacuum. This was more like a pressure cooker. Which takes us to the context that the main episode can only hint at. So why here and why then? Because when we say stress about the past, we can't mean it like a mood. In the early 1500s, stress looks more like hunger cycles, debt traps, sickness, and the constant possibility that a bad harvest or a bad winter becomes a literal death sentence. And serious overviews of the event often frame it exactly in that kind of world. Strasbourg as a place where bodies were running essentially on fumes. Now, people weren't just hungry, they were actively watching inequality happen in real time. They were watching rules tighten around common survival. Who gets access to food, to forest, to streams, to fuel, and to the stuff you need to not die. And then you add the institutional crisis of distrust. The sense that the folks who claim to be your direct line to God are still extremely human and sometimes extremely corrupt. Definitely sometimes hoarding comfort. Sometimes acting like the rules are for everyone else. Now, I'm not here to say every clergyman is a villain in cartoon history. I'm here to say that people believe the system was failing them, and that belief is its own form of stress. Now, when you live in a world where divine causation is a normal explanation, an affliction doesn't just happen, it always means something. And St. Vitus shows up in many of the retellings and frameworks because dancing and saintly punishment or healing traditions were culturally available explanations for strange bodily events. The key point is that once an affliction is legible inside of a worldview, it becomes treatable inside that worldview. Meaning becomes medicine. Now, ergot poison, or the bad rye theory, is a tempting reason for the cause of the dancing, but it's only that because it gives you a physical culprit. A fungus, a toxin, a neat little villain. But historians keep warning us if it doesn't fit cleanly, especially when you try to explain the social patterning and the sustained nature of the dancing. In fact, medical historian John Waller writes and argues that the ergot explanation isn't tenable as a full explanation for these outbreaks, and actually pushes toward a model that takes cultural context and stress seriously. So if ergotism is a flashlight, it's not the whole sun. Which brings us to the most oh no part of this story. What happens when the city tries to fix it itself? Now, this is where the dancing plague stops being weird medieval trivia and starts sounding more and more like a case study. Because the spread doesn't require you to believe in magic, it does, however, require you to believe in humans. In a lot of the modern interpretations, they treat this as if something like a mass psychogenic illness, mass hysteria, real symptoms spreading socially under extreme stress, shaped by the cultural scripts available to a community. It's not everyone was pretending, it's more the body is reacting to the stimuli around it. That's commonly referred to as just stress contagion. Now, social reinforcement piles onto it because once something becomes strange and it goes public, it gains fuel. It gains attention, fear, rumors, moral judgment, copycat expectation, and panic. People don't need to want it for it to spread, they just need to be surrounded by it. Very similar to how those clowns popped up in 2016. Nobody really knows what happened. We just know that we were not wanting to see a clown, which made it to where you saw clowns more. Very weird. Anyway, local physicians reportedly framed the problem in humoral terms. Hot blood. That's the reason that they gave for it. And they suggested that the afflicted keep dancing to sweat it out. And so the authorities built a response around that idea. So that's right, the cure to dancing is more dancing, provided staging, musicians, encouragement, a public containment strategy that also functions as a public amplifier. The good summary of the council's more dancing approach is clearing spaces, erecting a stage, and hiring musicians shows up in major retellings and coverage of the event. And this is the institutional lesson that feels painfully modern. When a system misunderstands the problem, the response itself can actually become part of the outbreak. It's putting out fire with more fire, except the fire has legs and is wearing their dancing shoes. Now, before we do roll into this week in history, there's one more moment that I want to preserve because it is important and it makes the story a little bit more human. The compassion that we see within the dancing plague is immense, because some accounts emphasize that Strasbourg didn't immediately jump to burnings and banishment. People tried clumsily And disastrously, yes, but they tried to help. And that matters, because it complicates the easy cynicism that we can approach this with. It says even in a world that got it wrong, there are people trying to get it right. Alright, so we're going to jump into this week in history now, and take a look at some of the other weird parts of the world. So on March 2nd, 1836, Texas declares its independence. That's right, the Lone Star State and a convention of Washington on the Brazos declares Texas independent from Mexico, an example of political pressure hitting a tipping point and instantly becoming a narrative, identity, and even a myth. On March 5th, 1770, the Boston Massacre occurs. A tense crowd scene spirals into violence. The aftermath becomes propaganda, memory, and the fuel for the larger conflict of the American Revolution. On March 6, 1889, aspirin enters the trademark register in Berlin. It's a pivotal moment from communal crisis to modern systems of relief. The brand name aspirin is entered in the Imperial Patent Office trademark register on the 6th of March, 1889, and continues to affect this day. And on March 8th, International Women's Day. Observed on March 8th with roots in early labor and rights movements, another reminder that bodies in public spaces become messages when systems refuse to listen. Alright, so now that we've gone over the days in history, let's land the plane with the reflection prompt. The part where Strasbourg stops being the headline, it becomes a mirror. So what was the time that your body told the truth before your brain did? A moment where your body clocked something, either burnout, grief, dread, anxiety, or danger before your mind was ready to admit it. Maybe it was nausea before the job that you hated. Maybe insomnia showed up for weeks before you admitted that you were just miserable. Maybe your shoulders lived in your ears for a month and you just called it busy. Now, I'm not asking anyone to hurt themselves by sharing too much. Definitely keep yourself safe. But if you've got a story where you realized, oh, that was my body letting me know, I want to hear it. Because that's the thread that makes the dancing plague feel less like a medieval glitch and more like a human one. Sometimes the body becomes the message when the mind runs out of language. Send it in however you watch the show, comments, DMs, we'd love to hear from you. And if there's one fig leaf we are glad to rip off this story, it's the joke version. Because from far away, it looks like joy. Up close, it's compulsion, pain. It's a community under crushing pressure. The dancing plague isn't proof medieval people were crazy. It's proof that humans under enough strain will find a shape for distress. And that institutions, when they misread that shape, can accidentally make it worse. So, again, thank you for listening. This has been Naked History Debrief, and I have been your host, Dylan Gassaway. And if your brain is begging for a palate cleanser after all that, go watch The Lion King. Or you could also eat a spoonful of peanut butter straight out of the jar, like a Victorian orphan who just discovered joy. They're basically the same thing. And so next week, on the main episode of Naked History, we're going to be covering one of the most famous con men in history, Victor Lustig, and his attempts to successfully sell the Eiffel Tower twice. So please don't miss it. I hope you enjoyed today, and if you would feel so kind, leave us 5 stars, a review. Anything you do helps the podcast grow, and I love it because this is a way to share history with everyone else out there. So again, I've been Dylan Gassaway, and this has been Naked History. Always remember to stay curious, stay dancing, and if you do hit the dance floor this weekend, make sure to stretch. I know history makes you feel a little old in the bones. So have a good one, and we'll see you next week, the same time. Have a good one.